Fragarach. Some weapons don't need to be swung to win a battle. The moment they leave the sheath, the fight is already decided. Fragarach, meaning the answerer in Old Irish, belongs to Manannán mac Lir, god of the sea and keeper of the other world. It's described as coming from beyond the mortal world, not shaped by any human hand. It came from beyond the boundary that separates the world of gods from the world of men, and it carried that distance into battle itself. When Lugh stood armed with Manannán's sword at his side, the text of Oed Cloen Tuiran records what Fragarach could do. No one wounded by it ever left the field alive. When it was unsheathed in battle, those who faced it felt their strength abandon them. Weapons lowered before a strike was even made. Manannán gave it to Lugh. Lugh carried it as a mark of divine backing, proof that the other world had chosen its champion before the first blow was ever struck. But not every weapon needed a divine origin to decide a battle. Some existed simply to ensure no one could challenge those who held them. Rhongomyniad. Not every king's weapon was made to be used. Some were made simply to declare that the king couldn't be touched, even before the battle began. In the early Welsh Arthurian tradition, Rhongomyniad was one of the select possessions Arthur refused to surrender to anyone. When the giant Ysbaddaden demanded gifts from Arthur's court, Arthur named the things that would never leave his hand. Rhongomyniad was among them, listed alongside his sword, his dagger, and his ship, each one an extension of his royal identity rather than a mere instrument of war. Its name, preserved in Corwych and Olwen, carries the sense of striking and thrusting. It was Arthur's personal spear, not inherited, not borrowed, never given, his alone. A weapon kept in hand, not for battle but for control. In Welsh tradition, that exclusivity was its power, a king defined partly by what he would not yield, and Rhongomyniad was the weapon that he held back from the world. Later tradition would call it a holy lance. The earliest Welsh texts simply called it Arthur's. But not every mythical weapon belonged to the king. Some were brought from places that no kingdom could even reach. Claíomh Solais. The gods didn't forge their weapons in this world, they brought them from somewhere older. In Cathmaid's Tuired, the sacred text of the Tuatha De Danann, the divine race who ruled Ireland before men, 4 treasures were carried from 4 otherworldly cities. From the city of Findias came a sword. It belonged to Nuada, first king of the Tuatha De Danann. The text records one thing about it with absolute clarity. Once it was drawn, no enemy ever escaped from it. None. The sword didn't simply wound, it concluded. No smith was named, no forge described. The sword arrives from Findias complete and irresistible, as if the city itself had willed it into existence. Later Gaelic folk tradition gave it a name the medieval text never used, Claíomh Solais, the Sword of Light. Scholars who traced that name found it running through a separate tradition of folktales, where heroes quest across impossible distances for a blade that blazes in darkness. 2 traditions, 1 weapon, both tied back to Nuada's blade, both pointing towards the same truth, that some swords are not made, they simply exist and shine. But not every weapon arrives untouched from another world, some are taken back from where they were meant to rest. Skofnung. Some weapons are not willingly inherited, they are taken from the dead, in the dark, from a grave that was never meant to be opened. Skofnung was the sword of Hrolf Kraki, the legendary Danish king whose name carried the weight of an entire heroic age. When Hrolf died, the sword was buried with him, sealed inside his burial mound, returned to the earth with its king, as if the two couldn't be separated even in death. But it did not stay buried long. The sagas record what happened when Skofnung passed into living hands again. It came with conditions that couldn't be ignored, rules that governed when it could exist in the open. The sun must never shine on its hilt, it must never be drawn in the presence of a woman, and if it wounded any man, any wound, however slight, would remain open, refusing to close. A separate object had to be found, the Skofnung stone, kept with the sword for exactly this purpose. Only when the stone was rubbed against the wound would that flesh close. The Laxdæla saga records that Geller took Skofnung with him on his final journey, and that afterward it was never recovered. A sword taken from one king's grave and never returned. Not every weapon can be taken from legend and live up to it. Some met a moment that they couldn't overcome. Hrunting. Some weapons earn their legend not by winning, but being the last thing a hero trusted before everything changed. Hrunting was ancient before Beowulf ever touched it. It belonged to Unferth, a man of Hrothgar's court, a warrior who had questioned Beowulf's worth, and then when the moment came, handed over the finest thing he owned. The sword's edge was spangled with venomous runes. It had been carried into battle before, and before that, it had never once failed the hand that held it. Beowulf took it into the underwater lair of Grendel's mother. He swung it with everything he had, and it didn't bite. The blade that had never failed met something that it couldn't answer. Beowulf set it aside without blame and without anger, and found another weapon deeper in that dark place, a giant's sword hanging on the wall, forged for a body larger than any living man, and he used that instead. When he returned to the surface, he handed Hrunting back to Unferth. Courteously, the poem doesn't call it a bad sword, it simply met a moment the world had not prepared it for. It was a legend, and the legend was, it couldn't overcome this moment. But Hrunting was not the only sword that failed Beowulf. His own blade would betray him at the very end as well. Nægling. Every hero carries a sword that they believe will hold. Beowulf's didn't, ultimately. Nægling was his own blade, not borrowed, not gifted in a moment of crisis, but his. He brought his sword to his final battle, against a dragon that had been sleeping for 300 years beneath a burial mound until a single stolen cup woke its rage and turned it against the world. Beowulf was old by then. His kingdom was already burning. He went anyway. And then when he swung Nægling against the dragon's hide, the sword shattered on impact. Not from the dragon's strength. The poem is precise about this. The poem suggests that his strength exceeded what any blade could bear. Every sword that he had ever swung in his long life of war had been pushed to its limit by the force behind it. Nægling was simply the one that finally gave way upon a dragon's hide. He finished the dragon without it, closing the distance, putting blade to flesh, taking a mortal wound in the doing. Nægling didn't fail Beowulf. The poem makes that clear too. It was Beowulf who was, in the end, too much for any weapon made by human hands to contain. And while some weapons break in the hands of their wielders, others survive long after, not through strength, but through belief. Joyeuse. Some weapons survive not as objects, but as memory carried through them. The sword called Joyeuse is preserved today in the Louvre. It's introduced as the sword of Charlemagne, the greatest king the Frankish world ever produced, the emperor who united Western Europe under one banner and one faith. For centuries, it was carried in the coronation ceremonies of French kings, held as living proof that their authority descended from Charlemagne himself. But the official record tells a more complicated story. The pommel dates back to the 10th or 11th century. The guard is the 12th. The grip to the 13th or 14th, the blade to the 18th or 19th. No single part of the surviving sword belongs to one moment in time. It was a sword rebuilt again and again, each piece preserving a belief, not just a moment. The object called Joyeuse is not a Carolingian sword, it is a composite built across centuries, each generation fixing it and adding a little piece to a legend that it needed to believe in. The name itself comes from an older world. In the Song of Roland, Charlemagne's sword blazes with light, changing color 30 times a day. A weapon so radiant that it could only belong to a man chosen by God. And that sword lives on in the epic. The one in the Louvre lives in history as an actual object. Both answer to the same name, but you choose what you want to believe. Some weapons don't survive as one object at all though. They survive as stories that refuse to even agree with each other. Areadbhar. Not every weapon has a single origin. Some have two, and the older they are, the harder it becomes to tell where one story ends and the other begins. Cathmaige Tuired records that from the city of Gorias, the Tuatha De Danann brought Lugh a spear. No battle was ever won against it. No army that faced it remained standing. It arrived from the other world, already absolute, a weapon whose power needed no explanation because its origin was already beyond questioning. A godly weapon indeed. But a second tradition exists. In Oed Cloyn Tuiran, Lugh describes a spear held by Pisiar, king of Persia, a weapon called Areadbhar. It was described as well-poisoned, a blade so volatile that it had to be stored with a cauldron of water kept around it at all times. Not to empower it, but to prevent it from burning everything it touched. The sons of Tuiran were sent to retrieve it as part of a blood debt. They found it exactly as described, blade submerged, heat contained, waiting for its next use. Later tradition considered both stories to be of the same spear, but scholars who read both texts aren't exactly certain. They may not be the same spear after all. 2 origins, 1 name, and a weapon that refuses to settle into a single story, but is super powerful and cool nonetheless. If you enjoyed these myths, check out the next story on screen. It's just as unbelievable and just as fun.